It feels like we spend our entire lives preparing for moments we don't know are coming, and what happens after one of those moments defines everything that follows. I remember, with a strange clarity that only certain memories possess, when oit ang persistent feeling from that time, a knot in my stomach that wasn't from hunger or actual cold, but from a quiet intuition that I was living in a prelude. My days had a familiar shape. The hours unfolded with the predictability I'd built over the years, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, a low-frequency radio signal that only my soul could tune into. He was present in that frequency. Our connection existed in a space that seemed to float above everyday reality, made of unspoken understandings, glances that said more than entire sentences, and a mutual comfort that felt too solid to ignore, yet too fragile to call a foundation. I watched him, absorbed by the small contradictions that made up his presence in my life. Closeness one moment and distance the next. Openness in one conversation and abrupt withdrawal in the following. It was as if part of him was always leaving, even when he stood right in front of me. And I, with a stubbornness I now look back on with a mix of tenderness and frustration, believed that my constant presence, my patience, would be enough to counter the invisible force pulling him away. It wasn't complete naivety. It was a hope rooted in the depth of what I felt and what I sensed he felt too, beneath layers of something I couldn't name or reach. The time we spent together was a balm, but also a constant reminder of unexplored potential, of a door that seemed ajar but never fully open. That was my reality, a precarious balance between the beauty of what we had and the anguish of what was missing, all orbiting around that silent question. What in the end was keeping him from staying? This subtle restlessness that once merely punctuated my days began to expand, like a dark stain spreading across the canvas of my life, swallowing the light of the few moments of clarity we shared. The initial duality gave way to a sharper, more constant pain. Each of his hesitant steps, each subtle retreat into that inaccessible space within himself, echoed in me like a small fracture, adding to an emotional toll that became hard to ignore. Conversations that once floated with possibility now felt heavy, laden with all that was left unsaid, with all the questions I swallowed to avoid forcing an answer I might not want to hear. I saw the inconsistency in his actions, the way he'd draw close only to pull away again, and frustration bubbled beneath the surface of my patience, threatening to overflow. I tried to articulate the knot in my throat that this situation created, searching for words to express the confusion and hurt to trusted friends, and the mere attempt to voice it confirmed the irrationality of continuing to invest so much in something so precarious. I began to feel exhausted. The energy I poured into daily hope, into trying to understand without demanding, started to falter. The sweetness of our moments together no longer outweighed the bitterness of constant uncertainty. I realized, with a painful clarity that cut like glass, that I was trapped in a self-destructive cycle, waiting for a change that depended entirely on his will. A will that seemed paralyzed by ghosts I couldn't see or fight. The predictability of my routine, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, an unchanging stage where the only action was my waiting. A new kind of determination began to emerge from this exhaustion, a quiet conviction that regardless of the outcome for us, I needed to find a way out for myself. The weight of the situation became unbearable, and the need to breathe air untainted by his indecision became an urgent necessity. The clarity I sought, driven by emotional exhaustion and the urgent need to breathe, finally solidified into an unavoidable decision. I realized my limit had been reached, that continuing in his indecision would mean the gradual erosion of my own integrity and well-being. I had to find words for the raw truth within me, communicating the need to create space, to step away from the dynamic that was consuming me. It wasn't an impulsive act. but the culmination of months of painful reflection and a silent internal struggle. The conversation that followed was heavy with the weight of everything we'd been through and the uncertain future ahead. The words were few, but the subtext was immense, echoing all the hopes and frustrations that brought us to that point. His reaction was a silent confirmation that despite any feelings he might have, the readiness I so desperately wanted was still out of reach for him. The internal barrier persisted, perhaps as insurmountable for him as it was for me. The weight in my chest intensified before it began to ease, as if a heavy anchor had been cut loose. There was pain in the decision, a sharp ache from the loss of what could have been and the separation from someone I loved, but also an undercurrent of strength, a validation of my own voice and my need to care for myself. It was an essential act of self-preservation. It wasn't the end of hope forever, perhaps, but it was certainly the end of naive waiting, of that passive stance that kept me hostage. The rhythm of my routine subtly shifted, now infused with his palpable absence and the stillness of a new solitude, but also with the determination to rebuild my life on solid ground, independent of someone else's actions. I took the first step on an uncertain path, with pain as my immediate companion, but with the silent promise that, from now on, the direction would be mine. The first days after deciding to create distance were an exercise in redefining the air I breathed. There was a sense of emptiness, the kind of quiet that settles after a constant noise finally stops, leaving behind a residual hum in the mind. The pain didn't magically vanish, but it changed in nature. It was less the anguish of waiting and more the melancholy of loss, the longing for what we shared, mixed with the cold relief of having reclaimed control of my own life. I had to consciously redirect my energy away from that orbit that pulled me in, focusing on rebuilding the foundations of my existence that had become unstable. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, finding a sense of purpose and competence. That was entirely mine and didn't depend on anyone else. I nurtured friendships that offered a safe harbor of listening and understanding, allowing myself to be vulnerable without needing to mask my pain or project a strength I didn't fully feel yet. Slowly, the empty space began to be filled not by his absence, but by my own stronger presence. I discovered layers of resilience I didn't know I had, small daily victories in maintaining my emotional stability. His memory didn't vanish, of course, but the pain tied to it began to shift, becoming a melancholic recollection rather than an open wound. With distance, I started to see the dynamic we lived through in a new light, better understanding the patterns, my own reactions, and what was truly at stake. There were moments when his name or some indirect news about him reached me, small echoes of the past that, however, no longer had the power to completely destabilize my newly fortified center. I processed them with a calm that surprised me, a clear sign that the decision to step away had been necessary for my mental and emotional health. I began to build a routine that was entirely mine, where my plans and happiness weren't conditioned on someone else's readiness, and this newfound autonomy became the solid foundation I leaned on. Just when I thought I'd found a new rhythm, a solid stability built on the foundation of my own autonomy, a circumstance disrupted the quiet I had cultivated. His presence, once just a distant memory processed with calm, returned more directly, more insistently. It was as if the universe decided my period of autonomous healing had ended, and it was time to reintroduce the variable that had most impacted my life recently. My inner world became once again a battlefield where my newfound caution clashed with the memory of what I felt, with the potential I knew existed, and with the pain of the past that reminded me of the risk. The serenity I had earned was challenged, not destructively, but with a force that demanded my full attention. I began to observe his actions and words with a different lens, filtered by experience and my new perspective. I looked for signs, Not of whether he wanted me, but of whether he had faced what held him back before, whether the internal barrier was giving way. There were interactions that seemed to carry a new kind of seriousness, moments when I noticed a vulnerability or effort I hadn't seen before or perhaps wasn't ready to see. The possibility that something had truly changed in him began to lurk at the edges of my thoughts, bringing a complex wave of emotions, a carefully guarded hope mixed with the justified fear of being disappointed again, of risking the peace that had cost me so much to build. I shared this new phase of my unease with a trusted confidant, trying to navigate the confusion of emotions assailing me. It wasn't the same desperate struggle of Act 1, but a more mature weighing of risk versus reward, of the possibility that the love I had let go to be or not be might, in fact, have found a path. That period of cautious observation evolved into a sense of acceleration, as if time suddenly noticed the urgency of the situation and was rushing toward an inevitable point of convergence. His vulnerability became more evident, not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in small cracks in the armor he'd worn for so long. There was a seriousness in his words and demeanor that had been absent before, an implicit acknowledgement of the complexity of the path that brought us here. My heart began to beat to a different rhythm, blending apprehension of what could go wrong with a hope I struggled to contain, but honestly was growing with each sign he gave. We had conversations that hovered dangerously close to the core of what had separated us, moments when the tension of the unspoken was almost palpable, but the promise of what could be said loomed even stronger. It was as if we were walking a narrow bridge over deep waters, knowing the other side held the answer I'd waited for, one way or another, for so long. Each day felt longer, each interaction more charged with meaning, as if every tiny detail was pushing us toward the moment of truth. I saw him grappling with something within himself, a silent battle that finally seemed to be reaching its peak. Being present for it, even just as an observer, was emotionally exhausting and, at the same time, intensely meaningful. I felt that my own journey of healing and self-assertion had prepared me for this moment, to withstand the intensity of the final weight without breaking. I knew the indecision was about to end, that the words that would seal the near future were at the tip of his tongue, and I was there, at the threshold, ready to hear what he finally needed to say. The tension I felt at the end of that phase culminated in a single moment, the focal point where all the energy of my journey seemed to converge. We met in a space that felt suspended in time, the very atmosphere charged with the imminence of what needed to be said. I observed his face, the way the light seemed to highlight the seriousness of his expression, every line of weariness or struggle visible to me. I noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing seemed held, the physical and emotional effort that moment represented for him. My own heart pounded furiously, each beat an echo of the years of waiting, the pain, the reborn hope, and the final uncertainty. All my attention fixed on him, the rest of the world dissolving until only his presence and my own anxious pulse remained. He began to speak, his voice initially low, heavy with the difficulty of starting, but gaining firmness as the words flowed. His first sentences seemed to trace the arduous past that brought him here, a bridge built from fragments of the past and an awareness of the present. There was acknowledgement in his words, an implicit validation of the complexity of our story and the barriers he'd had to face. I felt the crucial words were near, hovering in the air, the essence of all the waiting condensed into an overwhelming imminence. It was the moment I'd imagined countless ways, but in reality, it surpassed any projection. He looked directly into my eyes, and the silence that followed, though brief, was heavier than any sound, laden with the promise of the words to come, the words that would change everything. And then the words came, with the force of a truth long held back, a relief I didn't know I was waiting for until I heard it. He looked at me and said, "I'm ready now." Those 3 words, simple in their construction, hit me with the force of a wave that swept away all the uncertainty, all the pain of waiting, all the doubt that had accumulated over time. It was as if a key had turned in an ancient lock within me, releasing a flood of emotions that left me momentarily breathless. Relief, disbelief, a pure and overwhelming joy that made my eyes well up, a sense of validation so profound it reverberated in every cell of my body. It wasn't just a phrase. It was the unfolding of a future I'd kept secret, a possibility I feared might never materialize. It was confirmation that his internal struggle, the one I'd observed from afar with so much apprehension and cautious hope, had reached a real turning point, that the barrier preventing him from giving himself fully had finally given way. His gaze, fixed on mine, carried the newfound vulnerability of someone who had crossed a threshold, the seriousness of someone who understands the weight of the words spoken and what they represent. The tension that hung between us dissolved, replaced by a brilliant clarity, a mutual understanding that transcended the need for further explanations in that moment. The entire path, every uncertain step, every moment of doubt, every silent pain, all culminated in this now, a present, that felt more significant than any future promise could be. Love, in a way I could barely comprehend in its entirety, had truly found its way, not through brute force or passive waiting, but through the courage of a single declaration that sealed the overcoming of an internal obstacle. It was the emotional peak of my journey, a moment of truth and liberation that reconfigured the landscape of my heart. The moment after the words lingered, dense and full, the silence that followed not one of hesitation, but of pure absorption of the moment and its monumental meaning. We had a conversation that wasn't easy, as we needed to navigate the newly opened terrain of vulnerability and promise, but it was real, aligned with the truth he had finally spoken and that I had long yearned for. We talked about the path we traveled, what his words meant for the future, the hope we could now embrace without the reservations of the past. His readiness manifested not in grand displays, but in a new way of being present, a solidity in his presence I had never experienced before, an alignment between what he felt and what he showed that was deeply healing for me, a profound peace, different from the stillness of resignation I felt early in my journey of stepping away, began to settle where tension had lived for so long. It was a hard-earned serenity, rooted in mutual trust and the realization that love had, indeed, found its way through the barriers. My journey, with all its painful waiting, the decision to step away, the focus on my own reconstruction, and the cautious reappearance, found its purpose and validation in this new beginning. We began to build something together, emotional brick by brick, on a foundation that finally felt firm and unshaken by his past ghosts or my old insecurities. I still carry the scars of the wait, reminders of the arduous path I traveled, but they are no longer open wounds, but marks of resilience, reminders of my strength and the complexity of the love we lived. Life, with him by my side, in a complete way for the first time, unfolds with a promise that transcends any past uncertainty, confirming that the wait was worth it, not for its own sake, but because it led both of us, in different ways, to be ready for what was meant to be. Love won, and the victory manifests in the shared quiet, the security found, and the simple joy of finally walking together in a full present. Looking back on the path we've traveled since that transformative now, I feel a perspective that only time and lived tranquility can bring. The waiting, with all its anguish and pain, now feels like a different life, a necessary phase that shaped me as much as the promise of a future that seemed to hover on the horizon. The decision to step away, to focus on my own healing journey, was essential, an act of self-love that ironically, paved the way for the love with him to truly flourish. Our life together now has the solidity I so longed for, built not on the pressure of waiting, but on the firm foundation of mutual trust, open communication, and a constant, unshakable presence. We walk side by side in a way that transcends mere companionship. It's a partnership of souls that, after their respective arduous journeys, found their home in each other. He upholds his readiness with an integrity that inspires me, and I navigate life with a security I once lacked, knowing that what we have was built with effort and truth. Love didn't win in a fairy tale without challenges, but in the ongoing overcoming of our own complexities, fueled by his decision to finally be ready and my resilience in staying true to what I knew was possible for us. I carry a silent gratitude in my chest, a peace that isn't the absence of problems, but the certainty of facing them together as a team that has learned the value of listening and vulnerability. The uncertainty has given way to a deep calm, to the knowledge that the present is real and that the future, built day by us, is a territory of concrete hope, a home for the love that finally found its full right to exist. I still remember the feeling of the thin air of waiting, but the air I breathe today by his side has the gentle density of security and the love that fully bloomed when he finally found the words and we our shared path.